In today's Farm Report, cattle herds have been shrinking for the better part of the last decade, but as the USDA's Gary Crawford reports, a change may be in store.
The report definitely has shown us that we are in the expansion mode right now.
Agriculture Department livestock analyst Shale Shagham's comments after looking at the latest USDA cattle inventory report showing, first off, that the total July 1st U.S. cattle and calf inventory was 98.4 million head, up 2% from July a year ago. It's also the very first time in 9 years that the July inventory was above the year before. The report says this year's calf crop is expected to be 34.3 million, up 1% from last year. And Shagham says the most telling number in the report involves producer intentions for the future.
Producers have indicated the intentions to retain heifers for both beef cow replacement and milk cow replacement. Producers indicated they were holding back 4.9 million head of beef cow replacements, which is 7% above a year earlier, and 4.2 million head of heifers for milk cow replacement, which is about 2% more than a year earlier.
And so especially for the beef side of things,
they are really holding back the heifers.
In fact, Shale Shagham says looking at the July 1st inventory of cattle in feedlots, there were only 3 1/3 million head of heifers and heifer calves there, down 7% from this time a year ago. And those heifers made up only 1/3 of the feedlot inventory,
which is the lowest percentage of heifers on feed since the series began in 1996.
Cow-calf producers holding on to quite a few heifers for addition to the breeding herd. And Shagham says there's certainly plenty of incentive for them to do that and to expand the herd generally.
The returns to cow-calf operators, which is the first engine of growth of the sector, the returns are very good. They have been good for a while. And while they may weaken with increased supplies coming online into next year and beyond, they still have lots of available forage and plenty of opportunities to market these animals.
And even if prices for cattle do come down some, as they have already to some extent, Shagham says the incentives to expand are there. But in the meantime, as heifers are held back, not sent to feedlots, not slaughtered, it means, of course,
in the short term, increasingly tight supplies of cattle
and of beef for a while, but then that will begin to ease up. USDA forecasting about a 4% increase in beef production for 2016, most of that coming toward the end of the year. Meanwhile, the herd expansion definitely underway, and
it will accelerate with time.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Back in early June, when Department of Agriculture statisticians surveyed farmers about their planted acreage, fields in some areas were so wet farmers had not been able to get in there and plant a major portion of some crops in some states. USDA over the last couple of weeks has been out resurveying those farmers to make sure
that we know exactly how many of those acres actually did get planted or didn't.
Lance Honig with USDA's Statistics Service says they have done resurveys for
cotton in Texas. We're looking at sorghum in Kansas, and then we're looking at soybeans in Kansas, Arkansas, and Missouri. Those were the areas there that when we interviewed them back in the early part of June really had the most significant delays and the most significant portion of their crop left to be planted.
Honig says those surveys are finished now, and if there are any major changes to the planted acres that USDA had estimated at the end of June, they will be published in USDA's next crop production report, August 12th. That's the first report to forecast yields based on field surveys. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Personal drones are becoming a fun pastime, but as the USDA's Susan Carter points out, they can be a hazard to those fighting wildfires.
The popularity of drones has resulted in somewhat of a proliferation of unmanned aircraft. But the safety of these systems has come under recent fire. Jamie Anzalone is an Unmanned Aircraft Systems Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service.
Unmanned aircraft systems or drones present a risk to firefighters on the ground. There's been instances of drones actually losing communication link with their operator and falling out of the sky. So, we have a concern about our ground firefighters, as well as the potential for a near mid-air collision to the firefighting aircraft that are over the airspace.
Among the challenges,
our firefighting aircraft work in a highly complex airspace that includes low visibility due to smoke, mountainous terrain, turbulence, winds, and really safety depends on understanding what aircraft are out there as well as where those aircraft are operating. So when an unauthorized UAS or drone comes into the airspace, it can really pose a risk to them.
Over the 3-week period ending June through mid-July, there have been 6 instances where firefighting aircraft have been shut down over a fire.
5 of them have been in Southern California, and in fact the first one, the drone, if you will, flew at an altitude that was in between the air attack, which is the command and control platform or aircraft, and the lead plane leading in a air tanker. So we shut down operations on that instance.
July 17th, there was a fire in the Southern California desert area that engulfed dozens of cars and burned thousands of acres.
There's a real concern that we have for unmanned aircraft systems being over wildfires that are not associated with the firefighting aircraft. For the safety of firefighters in general, both on the ground and in the air, we're going to shut down operations.
Anzalone's message to drone pilots.
My advice would be to remember that these are aircraft and there's regulations that they need to inform themselves on, especially around wildfires. There's temporary flight restrictions that are put up for the safety of the firefighters, and if people are going to go out and fly their drones, they need to understand the rules associated with them.
Drone operators who interfere with firefighting efforts can face FAA, Forest Service, and state penalties.
There's sort of multiple levels that an operator that goes into wildfire airspace could be pursued under.
In California, a representative has introduced a bill that would make it a criminal offense to interfere with firefighting efforts on federal land. Also, an assemblyman and state senator are looking to increase the penalty for interfering with firefighting efforts from a $1,000 fine to a maximum of $5,000. State Senator Ted Gaines also wants to add up to 6 months of jail time if the drone interference is considered intentional and reckless. For USDA Radio, Susan Carter, Washington, D.C.
There has not been a reported case of highly pathogenic avian influenza among U.S. poultry flocks since mid-June. But Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack Tuesday noted the numbers from the outbreaks that have occurred since late December of last year.
232 enterprises and operations have been hit by avian influenza. Nearly 50 million birds have been depopulated.
And at a stakeholders conference Tuesday, the Secretary equated those numbers with the 3,000 additional workers hired through USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service to help existing staff with detection, depopulation, and cleanup efforts. And
we have expended or likely will expend in excess of $700 million in the form of indemnification payments to producers, as well as a reasonable cost of disinfection and cleanup.
With those costs expected to grow if another high-path bird flu outbreak occurs later this fall when regular wild bird migration patterns take place. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Biosecurity and disease risk should be considered as part of the purchase of livestock from a sale or farm, especially with the avian influenza having the potential of coming back this fall. Rod Bain with the U.S. Department of Agriculture has more.
County, local, and state fair season is gearing up. So are the many livestock auctions and youth livestock sales associated with it. Now, regardless of how or where an animal is purchased, like commission sales or even from a farm itself, Melanie Barkley of Penn State University Extension says animal health must also be considered by the purchaser before and after buying an animal. She says, for starters,
you're looking for general appearance, that may be a hair coat, maybe brightness in their eyes. You also want to make sure that they don't have any structural problems that would prevent them from moving out freely.
Even if an animal has a healthy appearance, the stress of transport after purchase could result in animals shedding organisms that could cause a disease in their new location. That is where vaccination for all animals is essential.
You want to make sure that your own animals are protected with vaccinations, because even though the animals come in with a vaccination to prevent a disease, there is still the opportunity that they bring in something to your own herd or flock.
If you are able to, prior to purchase of an animal or within 2 to 4 weeks before moving the animal to its new home, conduct pre-testing.
If there are specific diseases that are in your area, there may be certain health regulations that require blood tests prior to the animal being moved out of a state into another state.
Practice biosecurity measures in transport of animals and arrivals at its new home to protect all livestock.
The quarantine certainly helps to prevent the spread of disease, and I also recommend that folks that are on other farms or in other areas where livestock are at, that they wear different shoes. Certainly want those disinfected when they come back home. They should always change their clothing before they go back out to their own animals.
This includes hauling animals to new homes in clean trucks and trailers, disinfecting them prior to transport of other animals.
You also want to consider even cleaning off tires. If there's a particular disease issue, you want to make sure that the livestock trailers, the trucks, have been thoroughly cleaned so that you don't bring anything back onto the farm.
And Barkley says once an animal arrives at its new location, spend time observing the animal, say 5 to 10 minutes during each feeding for signs of disease. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
At this point, we anticipate about $190 million of indemnification payments to be made. About $183 million has already gone out the door. So I think we've done a pretty good job of getting the resources out.
Indemnity payments through USDA for losses incurred by poultry and egg producers due to the avian influenza outbreak of this year. And Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack Tuesday, speaking at a stakeholders conference to address what has been learned through this bird flu outbreak, says there needs to be a refining of the indemnity system.
Make sure that we're fair to the producers as well as the industry.
And to better understand the challenges of impacted producers, especially in the context of time frames to restock flocks after depopulation due to AI contamination. The Secretary says this consideration comes from concerns in the wake of the last outbreak, including breakdown of indemnification payments, especially in situations where the producer may own the facilities, but the birds are owned by a company under contract. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.